Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. I think we'll just start from with the recap of what we had done yesterday as well. We had gone through most of uh, the guidelines for cobalamin deficiency. That is cobalamin that how cobalamin deficiency is actually diagnosed clinically, because most of they had mentioned the lab tests, but most of they have also mentioned that the clinical findings are the most suggestive. So even with cobalamin deficiency particularly, even the clinical findings and the lab findings, they sometimes do not correlate. For example, there may be times when the clinical findings are not suggestive, or may not show neurological symptoms, but they may be signs of uh, uh, the levels may be low, levels may come out low, and there also may be times when the levels are low, but clinically the patient may not have developed this I mean the clinically, sometimes the clinically the signs may present, but the levels may come out to be and within normal range. I think there are all those variables that may affect the values. And also then we discussed all the clinical conditions in which we suspect uh, uh, in which there is a clinical suspicion of cobalamin deficiency. And with that we need to proceed with the most important, basically the point in this was that even if you have a suspicion of um, neurological impairment with cobalamin deficiency, then even we need not go for uh, testing of we need to proceed with the further test for cobalamin deficiency even in the absence of a raised MCV. So this was something that we think we highlighted yesterday as well, that there was in the absence of a raised MCV, even we should proceed with test, because normal MCV can be there in 25% of cases. So this was like the first hint towards there being great variation in the clinical presentation and the biochemical laboratory test. So we need to go take them both hand in hand, and then we need to interpret the reports also. There was also a lot of reference made to how the lab values will differ, basically from patient to patient also, and also based on the history of other associated factors. The most important regarding basically cobalamin deficiency were how to first diagnose it and to clinically. Now for clinical diagnosis, that actually we had gone through this causes of cobalamin deficiency. That is when do we need to suspect cobalamin deficiency, most likely in what can be the causes in infants and children, and most in pregnancy and lactation, and then in elderly. So these are our basic like groups in which we uh, uh, suspect this deficiency to occur. But there are also so many different and there were also many different factors that could lead to these causes of cobalamin deficiency in all ages. So these included the infections, mostly the H. pylori and Giardia lamblia and fish tapeworm. We had gone through much of the causes of Diphyllobothrium latum, how it can eating of raw fish and undercooked sea of food could lead to this. Then H. pylori, and also gastric causes and ileal causes like tropical sprue and celiac disease and Crohn's disease. So these are general causes, and the pernicious anemia also, which presents mostly in middle-aged people. So we had gone through most of that, but we will in fact go through it again as well in the testing algorithms. So inadequate intake was, of course, is also a main part, but this can occur mostly in those vegetarians who do not take in meat and eggs and chicken and like poultry products or dairy products mostly. So for infants, we had gone into much detail about all those genetic factors that can cause pulmonary deficiency. There could be deficiency of intrinsic factor in itself. There could be deficiency of the intrinsic factor receptor, which was the one that we had gone Emersland Grasbach syndrome, and other cobalamin, and also this transcobalamin. So there could be defects in genetic defects of intrinsic factor, and genetic defects of the receptor itself, and also genetic defects in the transporter in the plasma, the trans. So, or in, at all these three levels, also there could be genetic defects. And we had gone into much detail yesterday about the intrinsic factor receptor defects, Mercer and Grasbach. We'd done, I think, a great deal about how it could affect the tubulin and the amnion-less receptors. And then regarding transcobalamin deficiency, this could also occur, and how and because this was actually a transport protein defect, this could be treated with the high dose by B12 therapy, so that we are actually allowing passive diffusion of the vitamin B12 from this plasma to the bone marrow, and if there is a transcobalamin deficiency or abnormality, so these could be either deficiencies or quantitative abnormalities or qualitative abnormalities. So, and also dietary intakes in maternal mothers were strict vegans, and then in women of childbearing age, it presents around about the third trimester, and in elderly also, this had much to do with most of the. Basically, it could be age related with atrophic gastritis and use of drugs like proton pump inhibitors, and also because of simply because of malabsorption due to food bound cobalamin. So they were also much reference to to food-bound vitamin B12 malabsorption, which can occur in a variety of conditions when there is not enough adequate gastric output or pepsin that would actually release the cobalamin from the R binder protein. So then it remains attached with the components of food, it may be bound attached to proteins. It may remain bound attached to the R binder from the salivary gland. So then, because in the ileal, the absorption requires that it to be bound to the intrinsic factors. So if it is not dissociated from the R binder protein, then also all those deficiencies can present. So this was like a brief about the uh, all the different summary of causes, that is how, at which it can present in all ages. So we need to suspect it in all ages, even in children also. And in children, it is pertinent to note that mothers who are cobalamin deficient or who are vegans on strict diet, their children present earlier with symptoms occurring as early as about 3 to 6 months after birth, whereas those with patients, there's those children who have these intrinsic factor defects or the transcobalamin or the intrinsic factor receptor defects, they present around about the first to 5 years of life. And around about that age, the maternal stores have been depleted, and then they present with neurological symptoms. And then also, this was one chart that I think we do not go much into. That is the history, the clinical features that we need to look into when we are investigating cobalamin deficiency. So these clinical features, they include basically, first of all, of course, we'll be looking for anemia, and we need to exclude all causes of anemia. Like basically, this would include all those causes of macrocytic anemia, that is malignancy, myelodysplasia, and hemolysis. And and then also hypothyroidism and chronic liver disorders, they need to be ruled out. So we need to like go into much detail about the clinical history of the patient regarding all these symptoms. Then also, so there is, so these are basically the points in history taking, that is a dietary evaluation and a drug history. So diet and drug are important. That is what the patient is taking. If he is deficient of vitamin B12, is he taking it inadequately in his diet, or is he taking something else in his diet that is causing malabsorption of the B12? And then also features that would suggest that the malabsorption is occurring at the site of the ileum or the gastrium because of the cobalamin, normal cobalamin metabolism. Then signs of the cobalamin deficiency in itself, that is history of glossitis and mouth ulcerations. These are common in cobalamin deficiency, and mouth ulcers mostly likely reflect folate deficiency. So For an evaluation, we need to first we need to look for causes of anemia. If the patients come with fatigue, and we need to rule out all these causes, whether the fatigue or like rest or the lethargy and pallor and all these symptoms are due to any malignancy, myelodysplasia or hemolysis, and then hypothyroidism and chronic liver disease or dietary deficiency. Then we need to go into the dietary history and the drug history. So the dietary history is particularly referring to whether he's a vegan or on certain food fads, that is a tea and toast kind of diet, or a poor diet in itself, as a tea and bread kind of diet, or whether it is mostly on fast foods. Then a drug history, especially for metformin, estrogen contraceptive pills, OCPs, and proton pump inhibitors and metformins, and even then regarding the personal history, we need to know about the patient's personal, whether there are certain problems within the family, the parents and siblings, whether they have. This is pertinent for pernicious anemia with LIGO hypothyroidism. For this, so the past and personal and family history of the patient, and also any history of pregnancies, whether there have been multiple pregnancies, or with in cases of elderly, where there is whether there either there are signs of neurocognitive impairment in the elderly, with which is mostly associated with low cobalamin levels. Then also features of malabsorption, that is features of like malabsorption. Mostly we need to consider things associated with any sort of a previous gastric causes, like stomach surgery or gastritis, or any sort of bowel resection, that we may have pancreatitis. So stomach, pancreas, all these organs, whether they function properly. Then also in the and any colon disease, then mostly then we will ask, basically, since B12 is a fat soluble vitamin, we'll ask about stools, whether they are pale stools, and whether bowel movements do occur, or whether there is abdominal pain, or mouth or perianal ulceration. So all these leukocytoria basically is also because these stools is history of these fatty stools, and is important because steatoria in itself is can be due to pancreatic disease, which can lead to which can be as a result of celiac disease, or it can be also a small bowel disease. So even pancreatic disease, small bowel disease, celiac disease, they all ultimately lead to B12 deficiency. So we need to assess that as well. And pancreatitis, also due to alcohol excess, could ultimately lead to B12 malabsorption. So for steatoria, we can ask not about the color and consistency of the stools, but also about how many times they may need to go to the washroom, and also about flushing of stools, whether they are more fatty or not. So all those cases, they need to be ruled out. So pallor is itself, and even to rule out signs of hemolysis, we'll be looking for icterus. And for in cases of pernicious anemia, even there's just the color not only of the mucous membranes, but also the facial color. For example, there's usually a lemon yellow tint in case of pernicious anemia. Then regarding the mouth, we need to go look for oral ulcers, which are like mouth ulcers, more common in folate deficiency. Then we need to look for the tongue, this because they will be smooth, beefy, sort of a red tongue in case of B12 deficiency. So the glossitis is pertinent in that. And then also regarding the history of paresthesias and peripheral neuropathy. So these patients, we can ask history about these neurological symptoms. How we actually ask history is, if they are elderly or not, then we can even ask about numbness, peripheral numbness in the feet, or tingling sensations, and also about any sort of a tinnitus or loss of posture sensation. um, Whether they stumble in the dark, or have to look in order to put or whether they have to, like, they have difficulty putting on their trousers. They have to, like, balance and proprioception, both of these. So then stumbling and loss of sense of positioning, and even the loss of vibration sense, that can be tested using tuning forks. So all these signs need to be elicited, or even in these patients. So this is like detail about basically this goes both for cobalamin and folate. So we have covered this again in great depth. uh, so these are all the points in history, that is for anemia. And then regarding the dietary history, drug history, family history, personal history, and then the signs of malabsorption with the stool is regarding pertinent to whether the past stools, whether they have any sort of ileal history or any sort of GI complaints. Then regarding the as it is from the signs of B12 or folate deficiency would start from the not only the mucous membranes, the color of mucous membranes, but also the skin color. We need to note that mouth, oral ulcers, flushing, then from ears, also the tinnitus or loss of hearing, then from proprioception, balance, and um, like sort of positioning. They also need to be monitored. So it's like a whole body assessment basically that we need to go look at the patient from head to toe for all these signs of B12 and folate deficiency. Then we had actually gone even through these tests for cobalamin deficiency, and starting from the MCV, although the mean corpuscular mean cell volume is although it can raise suspicion, but it is in 25% cases it may be normal. This is something that we had noted earlier as well. But otherwise, of course, the signs in cobalamin deficiency would include the hypersegmented neutrophils, the oval macrocytes, the RBCs have oral macrocytes, then the WBCs, they showed hypersegmented neutrophils, and then the platelet count would also in some cases may be decreased. So some of the labs that we need to go into are basically we may even go for a retic count. This was not actually mentioned here, but uh, some like this is also part of the investigation, so we'll cover it there. This may be decreased, and this is actually increased post treatment. So, and is also used as a sort of a monitoring of treatment as well, so that the when the retic count increases promptly in response after at day 6. So this is used as a sort of a monitoring of the response. Retic count, even if for iron deficiency, was also used. We had noted earlier that the retic count can increase in about 2 to 3 days, and then by about 5 to 7 days it reaches its peak. The hemoglobin also increases by that time. So by about 1 week, it's expected that almost 1 gram per deciliter may rise. So by about 2 weeks, even a 14-day estimate was round about like 1 gram, 1 to 1.5 gram per deciliter. So in this case also the retic count is used for monitoring, and then also we have those platelets which are most you can be low, and they can be platelet anisocytosis as well, and really even a leukoerythroblastic picture can be seen with the whole jolly bodies and basophilic stippling also being noted on peripheral smear. But of course these were not mentioned here. These are just things that we discussed yesterday regarding. Then also we need to have an idea about the baseline liver function tests and the renal function tests, because renal function would actually be important, because the lab results would need to be interpreted in the context of chronic renal failure, which can cause sort of deranged values for homocysteine and methylmalonic acid and all those other um, factors. Then liver function test would those bilirubin unconjugated bili would actually even suggest hemolysis in patients with any sort of autoimmune disorder, autoimmune cause of hemolysis, mostly pernicious anemia even. And then iron studies would be maybe normal, but they can be increased even. Iron, so serum iron and serum ferritin may even be increased in those cases, unless there is of course combined iron and folate and B12 deficiency. Then also the DAT, because there will be a component of hemolysis, so weak DAT can also be present. But and then we need to rule out other causes of such autoimmune hemolysis in these patients. So like basically a brief some baseline would be there, but mean cell and but peripheral smear and MCV are used as hint, and then mostly it's the leading clinical history basically, which leads us towards the diagnosis of cobalamin deficiency in particular. Then we noted that serum cobalamin levels. We had gone also into much detail yesterday about the serum B12 levels, that they are the B12 levels, actually the serum B12 levels, they the serum B12 levels actually quantitates all the forms of cobalamin, that is the B1 and B3, which are uh, the B1, which is the inactive form, the transcobalamin, which includes this, it actually quantitates both the inactive form and the bound active forms. So the active form is the transcobalamin 2, which is also known as hollow transcobalamin. This is present in serum. And the inactive forms are transcobalamin 1 and transcobalamin 3. So the transcobalamin 1 and 3, they are known as hollow. They actually transcobalamin 1 mm, uh, is hollow transcobalamin, whereas transcobalamin 3 is known as hollow heptocorrin. So there was also some detail that we went in about these different these three types of transcobalamin, because it's actually these are the three types of transport proteins. And regarding transcobalamin 1 and 3, these are the inactive forms, and only transcobalamin 2 or the hollow transcobalamin, the hollow transcobalamin is the active form. And this is the isoform protein that is synthesized in liver and in ileal cells and the endothelial cells and macrophages. And it is responsible for however, it is responsible for only a minority, like about 10 to 20% of the total B12 is carried in the in the by transcobalamin 2. So the functionally active form, that is transcobalamin 2, carries only a lesser quantity of the cobalamin, whereas the most of the cobalamin is transported by transcobalamin 1 and 3, which of which one is mostly functionally inert. And these heptocorrin, the transcobalamin 1, this is derived from neutrophil granules. So that is why it is increased in myeloproliferative neoplasms, and also in hepatic diseases also it may be increased, because it has role in transport of B12 to the liver, since it causes the transport of B12 to the liver for excretion in bile. So this heptocorrin, which it is almost two-thirds saturated with B12, and it is tightly bound with B12, although it is this makes it functionally inert. So also there was a reference to the fact that the serum cobalamin levels would be affected by the amount that is bound and unbound. So if the heptocorrin were to increase in cases of myeloproliferative neoplasms, or in those cases, then uh, cobalamin, the total serum cobalamin levels would then be found to would also be raised, because if the heptocorrin is increased, then if it is in excess, then the serum B12 levels would also be false normal or increased. And then if the heptocorrin, if there's an inherited deficiency of the heptocorrin, that is transcobalamin 1, then also the level would be falsely low. So this is regarding the trans cobalamin. And this was something regarding the titers. We had done this yesterday also. The titers that are basically um, encouraged to be that they are to be reported are in picomoles per liter for B12, and that is the values less than 148 picomoles per liter, which is in the previously it was 200 nanograms per liter, which was taken as the cutoff point. Although we did note that there was a wide gray zone between 100 and 200 nanogram per liter that was previously taken as borderline cases. So that is why when we consider cobalamin deficiency, there will always be a it will always be divided into like two groups: those who have the classical B12 deficiency and those who have the subclinical deficiency. And then this is there's the subclinical deficiency. So we will be going into details in the algorithms also, because we have to pick up all these cases. The subclinical, those which have the subclinical deficiency, they do not have the clinical symptoms as yet, but they have basically most of the conditions that have led to cobalamin deficiency, and they can go on to full-fledged disease. So even these need to be treated at this point, even though they may not have manifested the clinical signs, but they do have the subclinical deficiency. So there is this reference to in the guidelines at multiple points regarding a classical deficiency which is less than 148 picomoles per liter, and even this value they had referred to the problem with reference material. There's no reference material basically to facilitate harmonization. Some reported in picomoles, some in nanogram per liter, but there is an international standard that they have now acquired, which will which will in the future help in facilitating the reporting. So around about 148 picomole per liter was the cutoff that they had mentioned. That less than this is like classical deficiency, and then there's this range of between 100 to 200 that they had mentioned could be clinical subclinical deficiency. And
Dr. Nadia,
yes.
is there any difference for lower cutoff value between age groups like pediatric up to 14? Is it different than adult or both the same? And likewise for genders?
Yes, this is something that they had not mentioned. They have just mentioned this range. I was also thinking that probably they will. They had only mentioned that regarding pregnancy, they had mentioned that most of the quantitative values that they have, they need to be because most of the other values would there be like a physiological drop seen in the serum cobalamin levels over the course of pregnancy. This is something that they note, and they probably mention in the reports as well, that in pregnant females may have like a physiological drop. But for other variables, they had mentioned just at the end. Basically, there was something that we read even yesterday, that when the report is generated, mm, I think it was somewhere here that whenever the report is generated, the report this was the basically point that they mentioned, that the interpretation should be considered in relation. They mention the values, but they leave the interpretation to the clinician. That is and it should be considered in relation to the clinical circumstances. So the value is reported as such. It just they do not report it as this is a subclinical deficiency or a clear cutoff. The only cutoff they have mentioned is about 148 picomole per liter, and this could also be derived from a local reference range. And can just we can just say that there is a strong clinical suspicion of B12 deficiency, but the interpretation would then be depend on the clinician. So, because falsely low serum levels may be seen in the presence of folate or the folate deficiency. So, even with folate deficiency, there could be combined B12 deficiency, and also they had mentioned just technical issues. And we had gone into much detail about the technical issues. Like I was referring that even if the components of cobalamin which are bound to hollow transcobalamin or heptocorrin, so if they are also deranged, like if heptocorrin is in excess in cases of MPNs, then that component would, which is actually the inactive state. So that would lead to a falsely high levels of B12. Although clinically we may not suspect like B12 deficiency. Then also if there is this hollow transcobalamin, if this is uh, increased in cases of liver disease or other like B12 long-term B12 therapy, etc. So even these could lead to variations in the lab values, and its deficiency could also lead to increased amount of B12 being uh, calculated. So and then also multiple factors regarding the technical issues were also that since B12 levels are done using ELISA techniques. So many paraproteins, in cases of multiple myeloma, even may interfere with the assay. So this can also lead to defects in measuring the assay. So basically, the whole thing needs to be taken in a broader clinical context. That is, what disease the patient has, whether he is a patient of chronic renal failure, whether the patient is pregnant or not, or on oral contraceptive pills. In elderly also, we will expect like values to be lower. In elderly and in pregnancy, the values are generally lower than in the normal population. And then so this was something that mentioned these are the limitations of these tests, but this is one thing that makes The hollow transcobalamin, of these they had mentioned that total serum B12 would be liable to all these variables because because it includes all the transcobalamin 1, 2, and 3. But then they also mentioned that this hollow transcobalamin is then basically the new diagnostic test that they I think would be more beneficial in the future, because this hollow transcobalamin or the this transcobalamin uh, 2 that we had mentioned, which is the isotome which is synthesized in liver, and it is responsible for it carries only about 10 to 30% of the total cobalamin. But the assays for this are not uh, actually much, they did not show much variations. And they mentioned this here as well, that the assays are they are actually this active fraction of cobalamin. They there's actually a very like in cobalamin we have this very broad range of 100 to 200 nano moles per liter. So with the nanograms per liter, and with the hollow transcobalamin, the range is very low. That is the in the upper reference range also is like they have the reference for hollow transcobalamin is 35 to 171 picomole per liter. So in the upper range would show fluctuations very mild, just between 19 to 42, and the lower range between 19 to 42, and the upper range also can show between 134 to 157 is like the plus minus that they have. So they have mentioned that that the variables and the cutoff point for based this cutoff point of 32 picomole per liter, which lies somewhere like between 32 5 to 171. If we take this 32 picomole per liter to be the cutoff point, then it has been suggested that it is like a very reasonable quantity to be reported as deficiency. Although they have mentioned that individual labs need to may have their own essays, but this 32 picomole per liter of hollow transcobalamin is considered by many to be like suggest a very good cutoff point. And another important thing with this transcobalamin is also that the levels do not vary during pregnancy, and there is very like much of the like analytical variables that we have gone through. Um, um, they are not they do not have much of the pre-analytical preparation. They do not require special pre-analytical preparations. So there's not much in case of storage or batch analysis that needs to be done. So these were like these could become very good tests in the future. Basically, the variables which affect all the other values like serum cobalamin is affected by a lot of variables. Then we gone into much detail about homocysteine and methylmalonic acid also, that their values can differ in patients with chronic renal failure. And then also there were specific reasons for both homocysteine and methylmalonic acid also. Like for homocysteine we have all those that not only but B12 and folate, but even B6 deficiency and hypothyroidism can cause the levels to be elevated. And with methylmalonic acid, because of small bowel bacterial overgrowth which uses the propionate and synthesizes methylmalonic acid, the levels may be raised. So they were like these were other unassociated like factors which can increase the levels of methylmalonic acid. So this was something that they had mentioned, that because hollow transcobalamin is not affected by a lot of variables, and since it is not by oral contraceptive pills, and also its values in pregnancy are also considerably stable. So this is one of the reasons why this was to be considered for routine testing in future. So I think that we have gone across much of the recap uh, that we had to 148 picomoles per liter was for serum cobalamin. Hollow transcobalamin was we had a cutoff of 32 picomole per liter. And we need to remember that whole transcobalamin has only about 10 to 30% of the total cobalamin being stored there. So the cobalamin saturation is around about 10 to 30% in cases of hollow transcobalamin. Then homocysteine values were like between 5 to 15 normal, and more than 15 micromole per liter were to be considered as indicative of hyperhomocysteinemia. And for methylmalonic acid, the values they had given was 0.27 to 0.75 micromole. So for homocysteine, we have 15 micromole per liter, and for methylmalonic acid, we had 0.27 to 0.75 micromole per liter. I think this was because we had gone much into detail about all the metabolism in yesterday as well. So this was all that we had covered yesterday. Since we'll be like running out of time, I just I think we'll just take a short break for about 2 minutes and rejoin again if this session ends abruptly. So for most of you, we'll just continue this pernicious anemia, and we'll be going through the testing for the intrinsic factor antibodies and parietal cell antibodies, um, because this was something that we had not done yesterday. So for all of you joining in, we'll be continuing this session with all the further tests, and then the algorithms that need to be followed for um, like probable and most likely cobalamin deficiencies. So I think we'll just take a break here then, and Shala will join again so that we do not have an abrupt end, since the 40-minute limit time limit has shown up for this meeting.